Sandy's new book. Just to formally introduce the two of them, Ian Frazier is the author of Travels in Siberia, Great Plains, On the Res, Lamentations of the Father, and Coyote versus Acme, among other works. And they're all published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. And his latest work, Paradise Bronx, The Life and Times of New York's Greatest Borough, is his magnum opus. A love song to New York City's most heterogeneous and alive borough. And we are so thrilled that he's here talking to us tonight about it. Sandy graduated from Harvard University and is a frequent contributor to the New Yorker, and he lives in Montclair, New Jersey. Son of Montclair. And D.T. Max, who is going to lead the conversation this evening. He is a staff writer at New Yorker, at the New Yorker, and his latest book, Finale, Late Conversations with Stephen Sondheim, was released in 2022. And he's also the author of the New York Times best-selling Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, A Life of David Foster Wallace, and The Family That Couldn't Sleep, A Medical Mystery. And D.T. has a Cocker Dachshund mix named Nemo, who spends most of the day in Edgemont Park, and he enjoys food scraps behind the quick check. The dog and family live in Montclair. And so we are thrilled to have this duo here to discuss Sandy's new work. And let's welcome them both.
I'm going to start by reading selections from the beginning of the book. The title is Paradise Bronx. It's about how the Bronx has sometimes been a paradise and sometimes a nightmare. And a lot of what kind of the way I look at it, it's like I consider it a human geography. It's about how a place makes the people who live in it, creates them, and how they create the place. The Bronx is a hand reaching down to pull the other boroughs of New York City out of the harbor and the sea. Its fellow boroughs are islands or parts of islands. The Bronx hangs on to Manhattan and Queens and Brooklyn, with Staten Island trailing at the end of the long tow rope of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and keeps the whole business from drifting away on a strong outgoing tide. No water comes between the Bronx if you leave out its own few islands and the rest of North America. The Bronx is the continent, and once you're on it, you can go for thousands of miles without seeing ocean again. The other boroughs, for their part, cling to the Bronx for dear life. The chafing and strife of this connection have made all the difference to the Bronx. No other borough has "the" in its name. We don't say "the Staten Island" or "the Manhattan." For some reason, no island is ever called "the." Only certain more or less continuous geographic features merit a "the," such as the Antarctic or the tropical rainforest. Before Europeans had any formal name for what is now the Bronx, they referred to it simply as the continent, the mainland, or the main, distinguishing it from the ocean they came on and the nearby islands where they'd settled first. The northernmost part of the Bronx's western border is the Hudson River. Then Manhattan fits up next to the Bronx on its western side for more than half its length, lying approximately north and south. Here, the Harlem River, which is a strait and not a river, and which connects the East River to the Hudson, runs between the two boroughs. Steep hills and bluffs rise above the Harlem River Valley. Much of the Bronx is hilly. Stone ridges extend like tendons, knuckles, and fingers from the northern border of the borough southward. These discourage the construction of east-west roads and make the Bronx difficult to cross from east to west even today. After the Harlem River branches off around one side of Randall's Island, a smaller tidal stream, the Bronx Kill, continues along the borough's southern border. Going along the top of Randall's, the Bronx Kill also flows into the East River, which is part of Long Island Sound, which is part of the Atlantic Ocean. The Bronx's entire eastern border is the East River and the Sound. Thus, the borough has a major river that comes from inland, the Hudson River, to its west, and saltwater on its east. Some of the Bronx is rocky and wooded like upstate New York, and some is oceanfront marsh and beach. A straight line with a few bureaucratic zigzags marks the Bronx northern border. That line is also the border of New York City. In general, people in the suburbs to the north of this line are richer than most people in the Bronx. By some measurements, large areas of the Bronx are poorer than anywhere else in the nation. But that assumes a population frozen in time. Everybody has to start somewhere, and the poor parts of the Bronx are often where people start when they have very little. They work and earn, and in time, with luck, they move upward, and new arrivals take their place. This cycle has tended to wear out some areas of the Bronx. The Bronx is the part of New York where the city merges into the rest of North America. The process has never gone smoothly. Its name honks, Bronx. Ideally, we could ask for a better sounding name, one that did not suggest a Bronx cheer, but Bronx is what we've got. The name comes from the Bronx River, which begins in a reservoir north of the city and runs south through the middle of the borough until it empties into the East River. The Bronx River cuts the Bronx into two sections, east of it and west of it. Surface streets sometimes dead end at it. If you're at ground level and not on one of the big highways, you can go a mile or more without finding a bridge. From source to mouth, the river is 23 miles long, with about 8 of those miles in the borough. It is the longest borough within the borders of New York City. An eminent old-time historian wrote that the Indians called the river Aquahong. I find that hard to believe, but I can't explain why. Tribes with villages in what's now the Bronx were the Silanoy, the Muncie, and the Wequaesque, all subgroups of the Lenape. In December 1639, several local Muncie headmen sold 500 acres of land adjoining the river to Jonas Braun, a Swede who had arrived on his own ship, the Fire of Troy. One day, fire and destruction would be what people thought of when they thought of the Bronx. Braun built a house on what's now 132nd Street, or maybe 138th Street. In either case, it was in what's now a southerly part of the South Bronx, and leased the land out for farming maize and tobacco. Eventually, the river at the eastern edge of his holdings became known as Bronx River, and Bronx land was the area in general. A man named Peter Schorstenewieger, chimney sweep in Dutch, owned the farm next to Bronx, which he cultivated using black slaves. Apparently, Schorstenewieger's river was never even in the running as a name, such being the workings of everyday poetics and spoken language.
Well, thank you very much for that. Delicious introduction, and I also want to thank Margot and everyone at the bookstore for having this event for Sandy. When I first started the New Yorker, I remember that I would go into the office looking to meet some of the famous New Yorker writers. One of the people I particularly really wanted to meet was Ian Frazier. And I couldn't find him. And I look all over the place, and I look in the lunchroom, and I look at the little cubicles where I work. And then we moved to Montclair, and I'm at the Montclair Bagel Store, and there he is, in the bagel of the schmear. So that's another little shout out for Montclair. My first question for you, which probably not been asked yet, so get ready for this, is, so you've done the Great Plains, you've done Siberia. These are large, naturalistic land masses. Why take the most densely compacted, most ethnically complicated, part of an urban endeavor for this third of your, what I call your travel trilogy when you're out of the room?
I'm happy you consider it a travel trilogy because I thought of it in terms of travel. And I just liked it. I liked going there. I went there to do a story about the Stella D'Oro Bakery, which had a long strike in 2009, which was it was destroyed by the private equity fund that had bought Stella D'Oro. And as I was doing that, I would walk around because the smell was so great from those cookies. And I wanted to see how far it extended. Because it was blessing the entire neighborhood. And so I just kept walking, and I would walk and I would say, and I can still smell it, and I would walk and I could still smell it. And you could smell it a long way away. And as I did that, I got into walking in the Bronx. And then, I don't know that I quite did this consciously, but I drove 50,000, 60,000 miles. I don't know how far I drove on the Great Plains. But I drove from Canada to Texas many times. And I drove, when I did the book about Siberia, I was driven by guys that I had hired, Russian guys, from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok, which was 15,000 kilometers. I mean, with side trips and stuff. I flew all over the place. And I thought, here's a chance to do a book without burning very much fossil fuel. So I would take the train from, right here and go down and take the number 2 train or the number 1 or the number 6 or the number 4 and be way well up into the Bronx and walk all day. And it was just a great feeling. And just like, I had my lunch, I had my notebook, I had my sunblock, I had my water, and I'm just out and gone all day and finding new things everywhere. So it was a great place to explore and not have that. In Russia, the fuel is so not clean, and they have no use for catalytic converters. And when you're in a Russian vehicle, you just know you're making such a mess with this exhaust. So it was nice not to have that, to do something where I could explore and not have that feel.
And now, if I'm remembering right, you had lived in, you definitely lived in Manhattan. You also lived in Brooklyn at one point?
Yeah.
So what was your impression before the Stella D'Oro, the Proustian? Yeah, but it wasn't Madeline. They made that cookie with cherry.
Yeah, what was famous was the breadsticks.
The breadsticks.
And my wife ate the breadsticks in her first pregnancy.
And that created, so it was kind of a distributive Madeline.
Yeah.
What was your thinking? What did you think about the Bronx before you got to the Bronx?
I thought what everybody thought. I had the just regular cliche vision. And now I regret it because, I lived in New York, I moved to New York in 1974. And my vision of the Bronx was like, if you don't get off the subway in time, you're gonna end up in the Bronx. And if you read Bonfire of the Vanities, one mistake, the guy exits off the Bruckner in the wrong place, and his life is ruined. The first people he sees attacking. So it is just a wrong view of this place. And had I had a different view and just been a little bit smarter, to me the invention of hip hop in the Bronx is one of the great contributions of the whole city and of America in the world. I think it's a great, and it was invented in the Bronx. Well, it was invented, it began officially, now people say, well, it was August 11th, 1974. And there's, markers out there that say this is where DJ Kool Herc invented hip hop. I just wish I had known enough to go up there sooner. So I didn't go up until I was an old guy. But the thing is, as an old guy, you have a certain freedom that you don't have as a younger person. So people see me and they go, hey, Poppy. And it's like, I'm happy to be Poppy. I go up, I sit on a bench. There's other old guys sitting on the bench. And you just, it gives you a kind of protective coloration.
So how many visits, first of all, the obvious question, so we would sometimes have breakfast at the place that we call the place formerly known as Manny's, which is the one on Church Street, now called Montclair, I think, Steak and Chop House. And sometimes Sandy would get up and say, I gotta go to the Bronx. Oh, okay. I didn't really know what he was going off to do. I generally, but you know, he didn't come with a kid. He just left. How many visits did you make? How many miles did you walk? And what is your favorite subway stop?
Well, I can answer that in reverse order. My favorite subway stop is Prospect Avenue stop on the number 2 and 5, because that intersection, so much stuff happened there. There was a jazz club there called Club 845, and it was like a famous jazz club for years. And the door to the jazz club is like 5 paces from this staircase to the L station for the Manhattan-bound trains. And I think of like Charlie Parker coming out of that club at 6 in the morning, kind of having played all night and going up those stairs and going back to the city. And I just like to picture the stuff that happened there. There's a whole lot of other history around that particular stop, and it's I think it's a beautiful subway stop.
Just for those of us who haven't, which is in the West Bronx?
Where is that? I would say kind of West Central.
West
Yeah.
Central, that's what 2 and 5.
Yeah, the 2 and 5 kind of goes up on the.
But I mean, I'm
other
gonna
side.
add, like, for me, I remember thinking, the 2 and the 5 cannot meet. Like, that was one of the immutable laws of the academy. And then you look at that, there was this crazy modernist map of the subway system in the
Right.
70s, right? And you'd see like that their little ziggly lines suddenly coming together. I never really believed it. So it's West Central
Yeah,
Bronx.
yeah.
It's like-
I mean, and it was the first subway built. It was the first subway to reach the Bronx. And as I say in the book, the subways, which came in from 1905 to like 1930 was the last subway that was built up there. When those subways came in, they created the modern Bronx and what I consider to be Paradise Bronx. And when the highways came through, they almost destroyed it. And that's kind of, I say, that's a sketch of the history of the Bronx in the 20th century. But
So back to Miles Walk.
Miles Walk, I don't know. My phone would not, I outwalked my phone's measuring ability. It died until I was done. But I also walked in the Bronx a long time before I had decided to do this book. So I went a lot of different far-flung places. I did a whole piece about Co-op City for the New Yorker. And so I walked all up around their Co-op City. Is really long, widely spread out. I did things like I did the entire Sonia Sotomayor biography, which is a really interesting book. And I went to her where she was as a baby, and then where she was when she was in elementary school, and then when she was in high school, she lived in the northernmost of all of the, Co-op City buildings, and she walked from there to Cardinal Spellman High School. And to do that, which I walked too, and to do that, you have to walk over like, I don't know, 8-10 lanes of highway on these various overpass type pedestrian bridges, and then uphill to Cardinal Spellman. And the wind is whistling up there, and I just felt like this is an intrepid person to walk to school. But so I did that kind of thing, a lot of walking before I started doing the book, and then once I started measuring it, I don't think I got to 1,000 miles, but I walked a hell of a long way, and I did in the book. There's several repetitions of the description of Jimmy Carter's famous drive through the Bronx, if you all remember that. In 1977, he drove through some of the most ruined parts of the Bronx. And the New York Times published the route that he had taken. So I just took that route and walked it, and I walked it over and over. It was just like, to me, that route is a historic site, because Jimmy Carter's going there got attention to the Bronx for the first time, national attention. And it was the bravest thing a president I ever saw do, because he had no solutions. He just laid himself open for Reagan coming back in 1980 and saying, well, he hasn't done anything. Well, he was just there 3 years before. It wasn't, you weren't going to rebuild the burned out Bronx in 3 years. It took a lot longer than that. But he drew attention to it, and then he just stood there looking and like, wow, what a catastrophe. And he didn't say, here's what we're going to do. He just absorbed it. And that was the first step you had to do. You couldn't go in there. It's like if you talk to a friend when you're feeling lousy, the first thing a friend says is, see a doctor. The first thing you want is someone to listen and pay attention. And he paid attention and didn't project himself. He just paid attention. So I walked that route a lot, and I will continue to walk it. And so that route is 10 miles in itself. So.
You know, one of the things that you do so beautifully in the book is that the term you used, I think, was human geography. It's true that the book is, although we focused up till now on the kind of, the little kind of nuggets that make the effort remarkable, it's really a book about people and people's voices, I think, like all of Sandy's books. And so, let's talk a little bit about who you met, because you certainly didn't just walk, take notes, and return home. You clearly made a remarkable effort to interact with people to the extent that they wanted to be interacted with. So, what's the community that you most responded to? Because, the Bronx is a bunch of communities. I mean, they're still on the map with their names, and you identify them that way as you go among them. Like, where was the place not that you felt most at home? Because it's kind of silly. This is where you feel most at home. Right here in the children's bookstore. Where did you feel, you know what I mean, that you were like fully engaged?
Yeah.
Like all of your repertorial and emotive juices were flowing.
Well, I walked a lot in the Norwood neighborhood and Melrose and South Bronx neighborhoods that were totally burned out. So you can go through and every building is new. And then if you can find a street with old buildings, somebody saved that street. And so I started at the street called Banana Kelly. It's just called Kelly Street, but it curves. Most of the city is in the grid, as we know. And Kelly Street curves, so it had the name Banana Kelly. So a lot of famous people have lived. I knew the famous people who lived there, and I walked around there. I met people on that street, and then I sort of expanded from there. And south of there, not very far away, is a playground called Playground 52, and it was a disaster zone in the 70s. And the people of the neighborhood built it, and one guy built it, this guy named Al Quinones, and he just kept at it and he took, again, courage like Carter's, but this was physical courage. Because Al Quinones kicked drug dealers out, and then just said, we're making this park, and he got so many people in the neighborhood behind him that he had 52 people working to fix this park up. And so it's now called Playground 52, and I was just there a couple weeks ago. Every Wednesday in the summer, they have salsa night. And it was like the greatest thing. It's just everybody up dancing and a salsa band, and it really is, it's a place that I really feel at home. And that was the first place I took my book for. I went up and I took it to the playground. The guy who runs the playground. Then I gave him a copy.
Somebody's salsa is going. So where and that's in the South Bronx. I mean, my kind of read of the book was that you were in a way drawn to the South Bronx, either because it had kind of risen from the ashes, or because So I was just wondering if that was your experience of it. Like, I don't remember any Riverdale in there. Maybe there is some Riverdale.
Yeah, there's Riverdale. I mean, I walk around up there, but it's true. I focus mostly on the South Bronx.
Even when you do the colonial history, which you do very, very beautifully, and if anyone ever thought Governor Morris was actually a governor, look at the spelling a little more closely. He wasn't. But I feel like that's where that's your locus. That's where you're really getting into things.
Well, the Bronx began on the edges, and that was the edge that was kind of most accessible. And this guy, Gouverneur Morris, who I just found to be an incredibly fascinating figure who, again, nobody knows about. And what I was trying to do was just say, you don't know about this, you haven't heard about this. But this guy wrote the preamble to the Constitution. And if you think America started with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is Thomas Jefferson, Gouverneur Morris, We the People, is just a brilliant, I mean, it's a simplification of a great big long preamble that they gave him at the Constitutional Convention, said, see what you can do with this. And because it said, we the people of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, we have a list of all the states, and he just said, we the people of the United States, in order to create a more perfect union. And you'll hear that in speeches over and over. And the open-endedness of that for our country. He was very much opposed to slavery. He wanted to make sure that the Constitution said slavery was not going to happen in the U.S., and he was defeated in that. But he put that in order to create a more perfect union, acknowledging that it wasn't perfect by any means. And he lived on the corner right down there by, if you go over the RFK Bridge, as you go into the Bronx, the stanchion that is holding you up sits on the place where his house used to be. And the fact, as I say, the Bronx is the place in between, and all these places got wiped out. Places got wiped out by the Cross Bronx Expressway. It was really a disaster and led to the fires, kind of. You can argue that it was very important in the era that followed the completion of the Cross Bronx, because the South Bronx burned after the Cross Bronx had been finished. But the fact that the Bronx is a place in between and a place that people have to get through to go to someplace else means that so much gets forgotten, so much gets paved over. And Morris's house was torn down in 1905 because it was at the water level, and that's where, just above water level, and that's where the railroads were going to want to go. So we would know more about him had he not lived in the Bronx. I mean, to me, he was like the kind of original Bronx person, and that's kind of, that's, I found this guy incredibly interesting, and he was ambassador to France during the terror. Every other ambassador in Paris left. Gouverneur Morris stayed there. He got arrested twice by people who were just guillotining right and left. He was there all the way through the terror, which was actually only like about a 10-month period, with no instructions from the U.S. Nobody arrived from the U.S. He just kind of held it down himself because they didn't want to kick out the only ambassador from a republic. That is, they were going to be a republic. They didn't want to kick Morris out. But while there, he just had this amazingly wild life. And he was also a graphoman. And he kept this unbelievably thorough diary with all his love affairs. It is fascinating reading.
Sort of making an argument that if he that he's kind of out Jefferson in a lot of ways, and that if not for the accident of geography that his house got knocked over for a railroad, there might be a monument to him in Washington D.C. As well. You're usually, I think, thought of as kind of an appreciator. I don't know if we can say that in the French, but appreciateur or whatever. That, like, Sandy is very good at picking out small things and appreciating them. So, for instance, the smell of the Stella Royal cookies would be kind of an anecdote. But the truth is that you're also very good, and you spend a great deal of time, I think, in this book on the legacy of pain of the Bronx. And I thought one of the things that was very interesting was you kind of see the 70s, or the destruction of the Bronx, is built into the seeds of how the Bronx was first created, and basically in sort of the racist legacy of settlement, the Bronx not being the only place, certainly. And I just thought maybe you'd talk a bit about that, and also about sort of the class forces that you see having operated on the Bronx into the 70s, which is, the decade that we all, this is not the history, Mike, let that out right now. Like, a lot of us do remember the 70s, and so, that's our archetype, right? So when you're writing to that period, you sort of have to as a writer. But I love the way that you linked it really hard to inequalities and injustices in the country. I wasn't, it's not your dominant tone, and yet it's there for hundreds and hundreds of pages.
Well, I mean, what I wanted to do is write a book about New York and write a book about America while focusing on this place. And it was a place where, the slavery was outlawed in New York, I think 1828. Lebanon Morris owned slavery. And when you read about the colonial history of it, when a black person comes up, you go, whoa, wait, you want to hear more. But they go by very quickly. The Revolutionary War, early battles and early battle was fought there. And then it was an in-between place where people of both sides, British partisans and American partisans, just kind of fought back and forth and raided each other. But it's amazing, I read all these accounts by Americans of the colonial army, of Washington's army. And I went to the huge mural in the Bronx courthouse of this important battle, the Battle of Pelham. And there isn't a black face to be seen. And if you read the Americans, you think, wait, aren't there, what's actually happening here? And then you read the French, and the French say, well, about 20% of Washington's army is black. You think, well, that kind of got by. We didn't hear that. And the French are just observing. They aren't, they're not there for any. They're there to be very French. They were extremely French, and they had the most unbelievable uniforms. When people stop and describe them, you think, pink, really? But I trust them and I believe them. And the British said that the British liberated slaves. However, they said, if you fight against us and we capture you, you will be sold. Which is kind of incredible, considering that a lot of the people that fought were free blacks who happened to live there, who fought for the colonial army. So, and in the events that happened in that place, which is called the neutral ground, in between the British lines, which were down around the tip of Manhattan, and the American lines, which were up by the Croton River. In the battles that were fought there, there are these accounts of different people in different, more like skirmishes. But the bloodiest ones were ones where one very clever British cavalry officers ambushed about 40 Stockbridge Indians who were very good fighters themselves. And they just butchered them and left them on the field. And the other really similar event was when Rhode Island had black troops whom it promised freedom if they served. And so they had served already with distinction down at Red Bank. These were black troops who were stationed up near the Croton River. And partisans went up, raided there, and butchered the black troops. And when you read about, where white troops are fighting white troops, they were very comparatively liberal about just saying, okay, you can surrender, just surrender. And they didn't let the Indians surrender. They didn't let the Black Rhode Islanders surrender. So you just see that that's always been, it's always been a part of it. And when it came down to are we going to care that this place is burning down? I mean, if you think about how the city fathers at the time or the city government looked at it, at first, no, they didn't care. And there's a really good documentary called Decade of Fire, made by a woman who was a guidance counselor in the Bronx, and she just kept pushing to make this movie. And it tells you what happened and how the people who lived there felt while that was burning down. And there's a moment where she says, they didn't care about us. And it's just such a heartbreaking moment. Because you can even go back when the Bronx was 50% Jewish, and they're talking about putting the Cross Bronx Expressway. Did they go to the neighborhoods and say, how do you feel about this, when they were planning it? No.
I mean, part of the reason the Bronx was so afflicted, as you point out, is geography. I mean, they're putting these roads through to go other places, and then part of it's class and also race, but it's a poor district, and you do a very good job, I think, of explaining why there is no, there was going to be, I mean, if there's a hero of this book, I guess it would be either be Morris or maybe, Grandmaster Flash, and if there's a villain, it's obviously Robert Moses. But you do a very good job of explaining, like, those things never got built, and when things aren't built, you don't really remember that they were almost built. They don't exist for us. Whereas, I mean, the Cross Bronx, which I gotta say, Sandy is nothing if not fair, but when he takes his son to the airport, they go on the Cross Bronx. And he wishes it was wider.
Not really where they end. I go to the airport to pick up my son and his Russian girlfriend. They had fled Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. And they had kind of searched around trying to find a place to live. And then they decided, okay, well, we'll give the U.S. a chance. And fingers crossed. And I went to the airport to pick him up, and I'm driving on the Cross Bronx, and it just happened to be one of those times where there wasn't that much traffic. And I just had it to the floor, and just that feeling is unbelievable. And I felt guilty and bad, but it was also just a rush. I grew up in Ohio, very near the Ohio Turnpike, and I used to hear the trucks going by that. You hear that sound on the Cross Bronx all the time, every day, when traffic is moving. And the thought that you could put that sound in such a densely populated place, that you could take a continental sound, that sound, when I would hear it, those were truck drivers going from, New York to Chicago. They were just running out Interstate 80 just as fast as they could get away with. And you're hearing that sound, and when you think you have that continental sound in a place that's all densely built and people playing on the street, it used to be you played on the street, there were no cars. And when cars came along, you said, car, and you got up on it. And then the car went by. I say that the time of the Paradise Bronx lasted from when the Bronx was paved, which was at the same time, around the same time that the apartment buildings were going up in the early 20th century, until the Cross Bronx came through, which was 1963. But when there was pavement without a lot of cars on it, it was a wonderful place to hang out.
One thing I was curious about, just because of my own kind of before I read this book, my knowledge of the Bronx was almost entirely the trains that would take you to Yankee Stadium. I, ventured 3 or 4 blocks beyond the stadium, and there was I had that tiny knowledge. But I was interested why this is certainly not an objection, but a kind of investigation of your artistic techniques. Yankee Stadium's not even in there, really.
Not really. It's been
done.
It's been done. and I didn't really know how to do it without. It's just like if you're driving and there's a big rut and you're trying not to go in that rut, but it's hard not to. And I do sort of refer to it when I talk about how Trotsky lived in the Bronx. Trotsky lived in the Bronx for a couple of months in 1917, right before he went back to Russia, and brought on the Bolshevik Revolution. But that was right at the time that, it was right when the Yankees were the dynasty was kind of starting out. The stadium wasn't built, I don't think, until 23. But the fact that, you had these kind of mythic people like Babe Ruth and Gehrig and so on, I don't know what else to say. As I say in my book, poets have already sung about that. Right. And I don't feel like I have any authority on it.
It's true that you're, I think, as a writer, you're often drawn to the thing that's not been written about too. I mean, I think one of the pleasures of, now I'm learning how to say it,
Governor Morris, it's a hard name.
Near Mars.
It's
I
got
see that in the
two
letter.
accented syllables right next to each
And how is he referred to by his friends, his many lovers?
other.
I know.
Old time people were not big on, if they had nicknames, they weren't telling you what the nicknames were.
No.
So I don't know what his nickname
Anyway, he was not, I mean, he was known-ish, so that's good for you because there is material. But he's not known. I mean, I couldn't have told her a thing about me, and I thought he was the governor, like public name.
Well,
Other people have seen
every
it.
other thing in the Bronx is named after him.
Yeah, Morrisini is a section, and
I mean-
Governor Morris houses, or whatever. In Morris County.
There was also a developer named Morris, which will throw you off.
So, I think given that we want to land this thing just exactly like an airplane flight coming to JFK with Sandy barreling down the cross Bronx, we'll do questions. And am I choosing or you're choosing the question?
I will hand the mic to the question.
Thank you, I'm enjoying this conversation. I grew up in the Bronx, and I wondered if anybody else here has, yeah, and I grew up when it was paradise. And I just wondered if you had written about the Great Migration and how the Bronx, in my memory, the Bronx changed very, very quickly from the way that it had been to a very, very different ethnic composition, I'll say ethnic.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things they say is, the Great Migration, a lot of people came up, and then there were a lot, shortly lagging that there were a lot of people coming from Puerto Rico. And I say, when this happened, the Bronx got better. And I said because people, I don't think, are aware of it, but people that I talk to who grew up then, and stuff that I read about it, you know, Morris High School, named after Governor Morris, was the most integrated high school in the country. You know, the music changed really dramatically. I mean, you had all of this from salsa to, you know, doo-wop, and then on to hip-hop. All of that was kind of a consequence of the great arrival.
I graduated from Lowe's Paradise, I mean, the name Paradise, you know, and 2 floors, organ, stars in the ceiling.
That was where your graduation was?
From high school, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What high school did you go to?
Bronx Science.
Oh, you went to Bronx Science. Okay, a fact about Bronx Science, which I also put in the book.
Sorry?
A fact about Bronx Science that I always want to bring out.
A very strange fact.
Alumni of Bronx Science hold 8 Nobel Prizes.
Yeah.
More than almost every country.
Wow.
So,
I thought the fact
Not
was
me.
we did it for the first country.
yeah, one of the first hip-hop was in Bronx Science cafeteria.
Oh.
Grandmaster Flash and the Fabulous Five and the Furious Five did a concert there, and so I could say, yeah, Bronx Science was an early appreciator.
And Moog, the Moog synthesizer
Was invented there? Okay.
thank you.
I know it's tough to generalize, but would you say the Bronx is recovering, prospering, gentrifying, or not?
Definitely recovered. I mean, if you can just go, there are a lot of movies that were made, or a number of movies that were made during the burned down times. And then you can go down the same street and everything is built. It's been really, really restored. Gentrification is it's a weird thing. Like you think, well, that will mean you see a lot of young white professionals coming in. And in the first place, what I saw in the most, like the nicest building, I went and looked at an apartment, pretending that I was gonna live there. And there was nobody there half my age level. I mean, I was by far the oldest person there. But everybody I saw were young professionals of color. And you know, you can get a lease for like 2 years at what amounts to like $4,300 a month, but it's renegotiated, it's only 2 years. So you gotta be making more money after 2 years, and I feel it's much more like a kind of pressure that just comes in. It's not like the population changes as much, which it does, but guys, a friend who was in housing there said that what you see is just a place where you went in and 4 people lived there, now 8 people live there. You know, the rent has gone up, more people are living in there, so it's like a, I mean, the people who made that movie, Decade of Fire, they show it all over the country. And every place they go, because they show it in like, you know, kind of disadvantaged neighborhoods or in community centers and stuff. And they say to people, how many people here can afford to live where they live? And nobody can. It's like just, this is, I mean, we know this now, but it is a real problem with, you know, you just, I mean, what is this, like 34% of the people in the Bronx, renters in the Bronx, pay more than 50% of their income in rent. And that's not what Governor Morris had. I just don't think that was what the point of this was.
Couple more questions.
Agreed, DT, that the Revolutionary War part was beautiful. And the question, I guess, is, it was the neutral ground, the Bronx. But contemporary historians, I've read a lot of the period, and often refer to the neutral ground as being in Westchester County,
Right.
which changed over time. How much does this contribute to the anonymity, this confusion over Westchester?
Yeah, that could be because it was, Westchester County was all the way down to what's now the southern border of the Bronx. And when the Bronx became part of New York City in the late 19th century, Westchester County, the border of Westchester County was moved up. And so when they talk about the neutral ground, it was in Westchester County, but that's not Westchester County anymore, most of it. So it does, yeah, it does make for confusion. But
Well, it also cites the Revolutionary War as being much further from Manhattan than you realize. It's right across.
yeah, it was right across the.
All, you know, all masquerade balls with the British at their headquarters across the street.
Right.
It was like Iraq.
Right. I mean, it was really the Harlem River. You know, there were engagements across the Harlem River where people escaped across the Harlem River. Or in one part of the book, people escape by swimming their horses to Queens.
Right.
Like, this is half a mile.
Yeah.
It's like 0.6 of a mile. And they were pursued, they just ran their horses in there and the horses swam across.
I really love the part of the book where you talk about Sonia Sotomayor, and when you met her, you waited for her after talking and wanted to ask her a question, and they told you, yes, but you can only ask one question, and so you said, I think the question was, who was the first Supreme Court justice you ever saw or met? But I'm also curious what other questions you might have had for her, because the part of the book where he writes about her is, it's an amazing, she's an amazing woman, and it's an amazing part of the book.
And why is the answer off the record?
Well, she just said it was off the record. It was William Rehnquist, so there's the answer.
All right.
Well, I mean, I admired her. What else I would have asked her? She talked a lot she had given a talk to these young high school and I think maybe some college classes about her experience in the Bronx. And she had said, get to know the rest of the country. She said, my confirmation hearing was one of the greatest experiences of my life. I talked to these people from Nevada. I didn't know anything about Nevada. I didn't know anything about water rights. I didn't know, all these things from the rest of the country. I learned so much. And she said, it is a great country. And it was amazing. The kids were just, and, it wasn't the way, it was not what anybody expected. And so I would have pursued that, you know, because I know a little bit about the rest of the country. I mean, I know about the West, which she emphasizes being, wow, the West, these states are so huge, they only have 400,000 people. And I would have pursued that. But I asked her that question, you know, who was the first Supreme Court justice you saw in person? And she said, what an interesting question. And then she went like this. And I felt like, you know, I'm arguing a case of law. It's like I got the justices to listen. And it was just like, it was a high point. And that was all. And I described her, I say, that when I saw her, she was wearing judicial robes. I wrote that, and then I went back, she wasn't wearing judicial robes. And I actually wrote a short New Yorker piece about it. Then I went back, she was wearing a dark suit. But she's a person of such gravitas. And honest to God, I feel bad for her. I mean, that's sort of another subject. But she's got a touch on it.
This is, I've worked in the Bronx for the last 49 years, and I'm still working. I've often described the Bronx as a colony of the rest of New York City. And the political forces that govern the city are largely concentrated in Manhattan. And we have finally had a mayor from Brooklyn recently, or the last couple of mayors. But what did you do in terms of looking at the local politics of the borough and how that may have contributed to some of its problems?
Well, the Bronx was very powerful in the 30s. I mean, it you know, FDR revered it and went up there, and there was a leader there named Ed Flynn. I forget his title. I think he was borough president, I think. And supposedly, if he endorsed you, you got elected. So that's where "in like Flynn" comes from. But I don't feel. I mean, what do you do if I may ask? If you've worked there for these years?
I'm a family physician and I do public and community health at Albert Einstein College.
Oh, really? Well, that's great. I mean,
and we got to host Justice Sotomayor.
well, that's a very important place for her because she would go up there because she's had diabetes since she was 9 years old.
And she brought her mother because she was
Her mother is this incredible person too, who died just a couple years ago, Selena Sotomayor. But once the borough, you know, the borough was, I can't remember at what point it changed from being majority white to majority non-white. But once that happened, its power kind of crashed. When it was, you know, majority white, I think it had more power. But I talked to Fernando Ferrer a lot, and I love that guy. He's really cool. And my daughter worked on his campaign some years ago. And one of the ways I got acquainted with the Bronx was driving her around to the thing. And I feel like I had a very good simpatico with Fernando Ferrer. Fernando Ferrer ran for mayor. That was what my daughter was working on. He should have been elected. He's, I think, just one of the best public servants in the country. I mean, he's just a great guy. But I don't know why he didn't win, but power concentrates elsewhere. It's not, I mean, I know an organization up there, I did a piece about them too, called Dream Yard, which kind of filled in with school art projects after the city cut school art and music in the 70s. And I've been to their fundraisers, and they have to work hard for, you know, they fundraise and they do. It's not like when you go to a Manhattan fundraiser and you know all the big bucks are there. That kind of, I mean, it doesn't happen to me often, but I know the difference between that and when there aren't so many big contributors. And so I think that it's, you know, it's a hard place to raise money. It's a hard place to, to get the city to spend the money that it's supposed to spend. There was a whole long period where the city just thought it should all go, the idea was planned shrinkage. And there would be no more, I mean, what did they think it would be? There were still like 1 million plus people living there. What was planned shrinkage? But they were closing, subway stops was in the plan. They closed fire stations. The idea was this is just all gonna kind of wither down and drift away, and that was gonna be that. And when they asked people, you know, the city officials, like, what do we do? They were told, well, move somewhere, go somewhere else. And people didn't want to go somewhere, which is kind of incredible. I think a lot of people were surprised at the loyalty and the just love of the people on Banana Kelly. Love Banana Kelly, and they started Banana Kelly Housing, which is one of the biggest housing organizations in the Bronx. But it was started by local people who wanted to stay, and the city was just thinking, hell, everybody's going to split. So.
Wait, we have one last question.
Yes, I was going to ask you, what do you think the effect of Co-op City, which was built by unions, had on the acceleration of the deterioration of the Bronx, and also, you know, it contributed to the racism that we moved to, because the Co-op City was largely all white, and in fact, at one point, the unions were embarrassed because there weren't going to be applications to African Americans, and they were forced. So one of the towers at Co-op City, that noticed that building was completely African American, because they had not previously neglected to give applications to people who wanted to move there. So my observation living in the Bronx was that people were just moving out of the Grand Concourse.
Right. Well, that
Co-op City.
people say, historians say, that the Cross Bronx Expressway was the #1 disaster, and Co-op City was the #2 disaster, because it just kind of took the middle class out of a lot of neighborhoods, and it was sort of designed to do that. That was part of the planned shrinkage. Well, we're just going to kind of move all the middle class people here, and by that, it was largely white people and largely Jewish. And it's not that, and the Co-op City is very percent. I mean, it's, I would say probably, I don't, just from having walked around it there, I would say it's majority non-white at this point. But it was a disaster in Co-op City. Yet, it, you know, a lot of people were able to find houses they could afford there, so, I mean, I think it was kind of a mixed blessing.
Well, I know we could go on, but we do have a timeline tonight. But thank you, everyone, for coming out, and most of all, thank you. Leading the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Margo and Catherine, for all the work you do keeping our town, moving.
Just keep writing, guys.
Keep writing.
Just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to pull up these chairs first, so the line can come down here. I'll pull the table out so you can sit behind it.